Abraham. With Abram, his name is Abram first, and then he gets a name change to Abraham. God extends the covenant to a tribe. So we went marriage, family, tribe. And the sign of this covenant is circumcision. And there's three promises of the covenant. There is, the first one's in Genesis 15, and God promises to give Abram a land and a nation. And this promise is fulfilled later with Moses, who leads Abraham's descendants into this promised land. And these people are in slavery, and Moses, sent by God, sets them free. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Also, so that's the first one. In Genesis 17, we have God promising a dynasty or a kingdom. And later, the great kingdom of David is established by God. And the third part of the covenant is God promises that all nations of the earth will be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. And this is fulfilled in Christ. So, going on, we have Jacob, and he has 12 sons. One of those is Joseph, who's sold into slavery, and that's how his family ends up in Egypt. He's sent off to Egypt, and later the whole family comes there because of the famine. So they leave the place they were, and the pharaohs, who were the kings of Egypt, charge. And then one day there's a pharaoh who doesn't like Joseph's family, and so they end up enslaved. So the Israelites are in slavery for a good 400 years, and then God sends Moses to lead the people out of slavery. So the sign of this new covenant with Moses is the Passover. And on the way out, God sets them free. They celebrate the Passover. They were to kill a lamb and to eat it. And Christ, later, when celebrating the Passover, establishes the Eucharist. He's celebrating the same Passover that the Jews have been celebrating since the first. So the covenant is extended here with Moses to a nation, and Moses is the judge of this nation. Right? From marriage, to family, to a tribe, and now to a nation. And there's some particular things that we can see in the Mosaic covenant. Something else I want to mention about Scripture is that Scripture is not necessarily written chronologically. Usually the books of the Bible are not compiled in that way. So you wouldn't just start in Genesis and read right through. Although some of them are in chronological. You can definitely read through the Bible, but you wouldn't be going through history in order like that necessarily. But with Moses, he leads the people out of slavery. They go through the Jordan River, and they end up in the desert. And God takes Moses up onto the mountain, where he gives them the law. And this is where the Ten Commandments come from. This is Mount Sinai. And so, with the Mosaic covenant, we see a national family. It's exclusive, and we have the place of worship is the tabernacle, which is basically a big tent, because they're nomads, they're going to the desert, so they can fold it up and travel to the next place and worship there. The liturgy, the public worship, we see in the book of Leviticus, and the liturgy is marked by silence of the people. There's several different types of offerings of sacrifice, but the main one is the Hatat, which you see there. It's the sin offering, because the main activity of the people at the time was sin. And the books that Moses gives us, 5 books of Moses, are called the Torah, or the books of the law, 5 books of Moses. And so we have God setting some rules down, some boundaries. Now, in our day and age, we tend to think pretty negatively about rules. We don't want to be told what to do and make our own decisions. And so I think it's pretty common to see that somehow limiting us. The language of Scripture is interesting. In a couple places it talks about we can either be slaves of sin or slaves of God. It actually uses the same word. And so the point is, when we give ourselves to God, even though we might use that same language, there's actually true freedom there. So when we're slaves to sin, to the things that lead us astray, that's going to lead us into problems. But when we submit to God, when we seek to follow His rules, He's leading us into life. And so we can see it as submitting to one way of life or the other. The rules, the laws that God gives us are like guardrails on the highway. Or as one author by the name of G.K. Chesterton said, he says that the laws, the rules of the church there are indeed rules and laws of the church, and they are like walls. And so people see that as a problem, these walls of the church. But he says they're the walls of a playground, because inside those walls is beautiful life. And I would add, outside those walls is death. It's like a steep cliff. And so God, out of his love, is giving us guidance. And this is why David, who wrote several of the wisdom books, talks about how he loves the law of God. He meditates upon it day and night. He loves the Lord's ways, his laws. And that sounds so dry and boring. Why is this? Because in the law, there is life. So, through the time of Moses, we have people being led by judges. And then eventually we have a king. Saul is the first king of the people of Israel. But he loses his kingship because of his sin. And God chooses David, and he anoints him. And so he's called the Anointed One. And anointed in Greek is Christos, so he's called a Christ, or Messiah in Hebrew. And so Jesus Christ is called Christ because he's the Anointed One, or Messiah in Hebrew. So, moving on to David, we now have God's covenant extending, opening up to even further to become a kingdom. So we just went from a nation to a kingdom. And the sign here is the throne on which the king sits. So we were at Mount Sinai with Moses, and now we go to Mount Zion with David. And we see an international, not just a national, but an international kingdom that's not exclusive, but now inclusive. It includes all people. And it's the first time that Gentiles, Gentile being a non-Jew, are allowed to enter into the worship of the Jews. Is there a eraser around back there? Oh, I did. So the temple had 3 parts. We'll just do it real simple. The Holy of Holies, the main part of worship, and then the outer court. And the Holy of Holies is where God's presence really was in a specific way. The Ark of the Covenant was kept there, and the 10 Commandments, the manna, which was bread come down from heaven. And the high priest could go in there only once a year and offer a certain type of sacrifice. And so there's a first century Jewish historian who tells us that when the high priest would go in there, they would tie a rope around his ankle, so if he died, they could pull him out. Nobody else could go in there, and he will fast. Alright, so here's the main body of worship, and here's the outer court for Gentiles. Yeah, you can throw it or bring it. Oh, nice. Alright. Ladies and gentlemen. Okay. So this is important because we see God's covenant extending to all peoples, and we see this inclusive aspect of an international kingdom. And so we also have a liturgy that is the Psalms, and it's marked by music. We have 24 hours, 24 choirs singing perpetually, perpetual praise, 24 hours a day. And we have the main type of offering is the Todah, which is Hebrew for thanks, thanksgiving. And in Greek, that's translated Eucharistia, which is where we get our word Eucharist from, the offering of thanks. And the literature, we had the law, the Torah of Moses. Now we have the Hakmah, which is wisdom. So we have the books of Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Wisdom of Solomon, and so forth.